All right, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Max Schwager from Stanford University, where he's the director of the Multi-Robot Systems Group. It is often said in autonomous racing or even in regular racing, you will hear drivers when they are feeling philosophical, they will often say, racing is like playing chess at 200 miles an hour. And there is a lot of truth to that because, just like in chess, you have to predict your opponent's move, and you have to take that into account when you plan your own move. And there is no better person to talk about this aspect of racing than Mac, who has been a game theory expert and looking at various game theoretic underpinnings of multi-agent systems, especially when it comes to racing, whether it is in the air or on the ground, as you can see in this small little images on this introductory slide. So it's a great pleasure that Mac is joining us. Mac, I'm going to make you the host of this meeting so you can share your screen and take it away.
Well, thank you for the very kind introduction. And you all can see my screen, I hope, and my slides.
Yes, we're all set.
Excellent, excellent. Oh yeah, great. I'm so happy to be able to join you virtually today. I wish I could be there in person, especially there in Philadelphia. I spent some time during my postdoc at UPenn, and so it would have been magical to go back there and kind of be part of the re-jumpstart of the robotics research world, the in-person aspect of the robotics research world. But alas, I had other things that kept me here. In any case, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Yeah, I'm really excited about the theme of this workshop, autonomous racing, of course. And I think it's nice to see the contrast between what I'll talk about and the previous speaker with the more on-chip systems and real-time computing for racing. What I'm going to be talking about is much more algorithmic. So my talk is game theoretic planning for autonomous racing and beyond. And I want to emphasize the and beyond because, of course, autonomous racing is not an end unto itself. We as engineers should be interested in developing technologies that are ultimately going to help people on a large scale. And so part of my talk, I'm going to focus on what we can draw out of autonomous racing as kind of a prototype and then apply to other systems like autonomous driving and autonomous UAVs for situations that aren't necessarily head-to-head competitions, but still very important in practice. So game theoretic planning, yeah, I understand this workshop and autonomous racing in general. There are many different aspects that make autonomous racing hard. But the thing that I'm most drawn to, and by the way, I'm going to be talking quite a bit about autonomous drone racing, but I do work also on autonomous car racing. I think they're kind of two examples of the same problem. So here's a human piloted drone racing example. It's called first person viewer drone racing. And you can see it's very fast and exciting, and there's huge autonomy challenges here. As I said, this is not autonomous, it's human piloted. But there's amazing visual perception going on here, amazing nonlinear, highly dynamic control, very fast computation. But the piece that most intrigues me here is the chess playing, so to speak, which was very nicely put earlier. The fact that the racer has to constantly think about what the other opponents are doing and make maneuvers to hold their position in the race and to try to gain an advantage in the race. And that's what I mean by game theory. And so we've done a lot of work in applying game theory toward racing problems and also problems outside of the racing domain. Here's our example of a drone race, admittedly a little slower than the human piloted drone race, but we're working on speeding these things up. And what I want to point out here is the distinction between traditional planning methods for racing or general competitive scenarios versus game theoretic planning. And you would have seen a few minutes ago on that video that the little green drone overtook the blue drone. And he was able to do that because he's using a game theoretic planner that reasons about what the blue drone is trying to do and is able to take advantage of what the blue drone is trying to do in order to gain an advantage on the track. So let's talk about the basics of game theory and how we think about game theory in terms of robotic racing and robots in general. So in game theory, it's very much like optimal control in a sense. This is dynamic game theory, by the way. Very much like optimal control, with the key distinction that you have multiple actors and every actor has its own objective function, its own distinct objective function. So here you have robot I has objective function J. And what makes it a game the definition of a game is that this objective function depends on robot eyes, I'll call it strategy, you say sequence of control inputs or policy, but it also depends on those of the other robots. And robot eye is, of course, in control of its own decision variables, its own strategy, but it has no control over the other robot strategies, not directly anyway. And so it needs to find a kind of a compromise, right? What is really unique about racing problems and many robot game theory problems is that constraints are crucial, in particular because the robot in a race needs to stay on the road, and because the robot in the race can't hit its opponents. Otherwise, it's not a fair race, right? It's a different kind of competition. So those constraints are essential. In more traditional game theory treatments, usually the constraints are seen as exotic or are not considered at all. So in robotics, the constraints are essential. And so when you include constraints in a Nash equilibrium, a Nash style game, it's called a generalized Nash style game. And the definition of a Nash equilibrium, of course, we're all kind of colloquially familiar with what a Nash equilibrium is, but the mathematical definition is that in a Nash equilibrium, in a generalized Nash equilibrium, every robot is choosing a strategy which optimizes its objective function, assuming that all of the other robots' strategies are fixed. And that's what this says, right? So for all I, this optimality condition has to be true. And another way to think of this, and what's commonly described as the colloquial definition of a Nash equilibrium, is that no robot or no actor can unilaterally improve its objective. If, I know that I'm acting only on my own, I'm not in collusion with anybody else, I can't do any better than what I'm doing right now. That's a Nash equilibrium. And so our overarching hypothesis is that racing and other multi-robot interactive scenarios like autonomous driving are governed by these kinds of equilibria or approximations to these kinds of equilibria, which evolve dynamically over time as more information becomes available to the actors. So let's think about this definition of a Nash equilibrium in terms of drone racing or car racing. And in particular, I think it's easiest to imagine the nature of this kind of equilibrium if you imagine kind of the procedure of the most common algorithm that's used to find Nash equilibria. So that most common algorithm is called iterative best response. And I'll be honest, it's not a very good algorithm, but it illustrates the point, and I'll talk more about more sophisticated algorithms. So, all right, suppose we're the gray drone. That's our drone that we're in control of. Iterative best response says the gray drone is first going to plan a path for the green drone to optimize what it thinks the green drone's objective is. So the gray drone is kind of simulating what the green drone will do. And then the gray drone optimizes its response to that. So it says, now the green drone's path is fixed, I cannot change it. Now I'm going to optimize my response. That's the best response. And then it locks in its own gray path and then re-optimizes in its imagination for the green actor. That's the iterative best response. And it keeps iterating back and forth between itself and its competitor. And if there are more than one competitors, it does round robin. It iterates among all of them in sequence. And so you can prove that this simple algorithm, if it converges, if you're actually finding the optimal best response at each time step, it does converge to a Nash equilibrium. The problem is that there's very little known about the iterative convergence of this algorithm, whether or not it actually achieves a Nash equilibrium, how fast, and in which cases it does, in which cases it doesn't. And furthermore, what's really crucial in our situation is that this algorithm just doesn't work when there are state constraints, collision constraints. And the reason is pretty simple. The reason is because the first player to take an action in this iteration has a huge advantage because it can act in an unconstrained way. So the green drone, we're planning the green drone's trajectory without constraints. And then the gray drone needs to avoid collision with the green drone without any negotiation, right? The gray drone is simply at the mercy of the green drone. It must avoid collisions with the green drone. And then those constraints are locked in from then going forward. So the green drone has a massive advantage by going first in the iteration. So our first contribution to this game theoretic planning for the robotics context was to rethink this iterative best response algorithm and think about how can we level the playing field and sort of still converge to reasonable Nash equilibria given this huge advantage that the first iterate has. And what we did is that we thought about the first order conditions that are at play at a Nash equilibrium when there are constraints. So you imagine you've gone through multiple iterations, maybe it's the first, maybe it's the 10th, who knows? And you look at the conditions which describe the optimality of your your opponent's most recent response. So J is the opponent, I is my index, and this is the condition that describes the optimality of J's response in the previous iteration. And so what I notice here is that if we're in danger of colliding, if we're relatively close on the shared racetrack, then a collision avoidance constraint will be activated, which means that there will be a non-zero Lagrange multiplier and there will be some non-zero collision constraint. So the gradient of the collision constraint will be non-zero. And then the multiplier is like how much in effect or how much weight that collision constraint has. And we notice that the objective value of our opponent is now dependent on our strategy through this collision avoidance constraint. In other words, the threat of collision is our lever for finding or negotiating with our opponent about the appropriate set of trajectories. And so what we do, and this is called the sensitivity, by the way, of J's solution with respect to I, where J is the opponent and I is the ego vehicle. So then what we do is we take this sensitivity term and we plop it down in the objective function of our agent, the ego agent. And what this says is basically, my objective now is not only to optimize my own objective, but also to penalize my opponent, subject to the original constraints. I can't hit my opponent and I have to stay on the track. And so this is our modification. It's called sensitivity enhanced IBR. It has a huge effect actually on the convergence of IBR to reasonable solutions for racing. And the alpha is a free parameter, which something like correlates to some kind of aggressiveness. If alpha is really high, then you're kind of finding solutions that are very aggressive on the racetrack. And it turns out we can solve this at least approximately with an off-the-shelf solver, optimization solver, in about 20 milliseconds per iteration. So it's fast enough to be solved in a real-time receding horizon loop. And what's also interesting is that this modification of the objective function of the ego agent doesn't change the Nash equilibria. So the fixed point, which defines the Nash equilibria, remain the same under this addition to the objective function, which is interesting. So then how do we port this into the problem of racing, autonomous racing? So we basically phrase this as an optimal control problem, but within a game. So the objective for the racers is to move as far as possible along the track, subject to its own dynamics. And we typically use very simple single integrator, discrete time single integrator dynamics, constrained to avoid collisions with our opponents, constrained to stay on the track. So you have some track lines on the left and the right, and you have to stay within those. And also you have an input constraint. You cannot command an arbitrarily high speed. Now what's interesting is, notice I was harping on before about how important collision constraints are in formulating robotics problems as games. And this is why. Notice the indices here, the subscripts, go through this entire problem, and the only line here that has an index J is the collision constraint. And it makes sense if you think about it. The only reason the race is indeed a game in the sense of game theory is because of the collision constraint. If there were not a collision constraint, if I could, if the drones were ghosts and they could overlap without penalty, then it wouldn't be a game. It would just be a time trial. It would just be go as fast as possible. The thing that produces an interesting interaction is the collision avoidance constraint. That's where the agent J impinges on the objective function of agent I. Okay, so we've used this sensitivity enhanced iterative best response within this racing style formulation for drone racing. That's what you see here. This is joint work by Ricardo Spica, a former postdoc, longtime collaborator Eduardo Montejano, who's at University of Saragossa, Eric Christofalo and Zijian Wang, who are both former PhD students. And there's a few more things going on here than what I discussed originally. So firstly, you see the plans, the kind of receding horizon plans of the two drones. The green drone is ours. The blue drone is a more traditional model predictive control drone, which is not using game theory. And furthermore, what's interesting here is we did all onboard perception for perceiving the other drones, the opponent's relative pose. So each drone has an onboard camera and also has a little orange ball on top. And we control the yaw angle of the drone so that the camera is always looking towards the opponent. And we extract the relative pose of the opponent entirely from this computer vision, onboard computer vision, using ball tracking. We're also flying through the gates, as you can see, and staying on the track. We've adapted this to autonomous car driving, which is the main point of this adaptation was to deal with the more complex dynamics of ground vehicles and the non-holonomic constraint. And in fact, what we did is we instead of planning just that first order integrator model, we planned a spline and then followed the spline with a differential flatness style controller for the vehicle to follow the spline. And we, again, can do this in real time. So the leading car is using a traditional controller, MPC, and the trailing car is using a game theoretic controller. And you'll see that the trailing car can overtake. Now, I'll talk a little bit about how we set up these races to kind of scientifically investigate which racer is better and which is worse. We essentially take a faster vehicle and we start it behind, and we take a slower vehicle and we start it ahead. And then we equip one vehicle with a game theoretic planner and one vehicle with a traditional planner. And then we run a number of races and collect statistics. And then we swap the planners. We put the game theoretic planner on the front and the MPC planner on the back and run statistical races. And I'll show you plots in a minute that show that the game theoretic planner, whether it's the slower car in front or the faster car in back, it dominates the race. So we've also implemented this on a full-size autonomous car. This is the X1 vehicle, which is entirely homegrown, built from the nuts and bolts up at Stanford. And we collaborate with another lab, which is led by Professor Chris Gerdes here at Stanford to use this car. So this was a set of experiments performed at a racetrack in Northern California. And what we did is we simulated the opponent car. We have one full-scale car, which is the ego vehicle, and the opponent car is simulated. We did this, of course, for safety reasons, because we have my two students, Mingyu Wang and Xijian Wang, in the seat here, and we don't want them to be subjected to any safety hazards due to dangerous racing conditions. And so here, what you're seeing is actually the slower car that's running the game theoretic controller is in the lead. The faster car is behind, and the lead car is able to defend its position, even though it's slower, because it's smarter. The game theoretic planner has more intelligence built in, essentially. We've also been able to scale this up to larger numbers of drones. Here's 4 drones flying in the lab. Here's 6 drones flying in a simulated course. And the trick to this speed up was through parallel computation. So we have a journal paper, which is referenced here, which shows that you can parallelize the computations in this iterative best response style algorithm. And this is work mainly by Xijian Wang, my former PhD student. So as I mentioned before, we can establish that the game theoretic planner is actually the dominant planner by defining a starting box for the race. And we have 3 drones that are slower, but use one planner or controller, and then 3 drones that are faster that start behind, but they use the different planner. And so on this set of plots, the slower drones were using game theoretic planning, the faster ones were using MPC, and then we reverse. So then the slower ones were MPC, the faster ones were game theoretic planning. And this is the lag time from the leader on the y-axis here. So lower is better. So here, game theoretic planner takes 1st, 2nd, and 3rd place, totally dominates. And again, if you swap the positions, game theoretic planner again dominates, takes 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. So it makes a big difference. So we've teamed up also with a group at Microsoft Research run by Ashish Kapoor, this is the group that developed the AirSim drone simulation environment. And we teamed up with them to run a competition in NeurIPS 2019 called Game of Drones, where we developed an add-on to their AirSim simulator called AirSim Drone Racing Lab that was basically outfitting AirSim in a number of different racing environments with racing gates and a score tabulation mechanism and a starting block and all of these features to actually organize and run simulated races. And then The competition was to have people submit their autonomous racing codes and then race them in real time at the competition. So we had lots of interest from groups in many countries around the world, over 100 entries. That was quite exciting. We have a paper describing the results of this. So let's talk about and beyond. What can we, racing is fun, it's exciting, it's a great way to, I think, promote interest in research and sort of safety critical autonomy at the limits of dynamics and control. But where can we push this into the real world that's gonna really have an impact on people's lives? And of course, I think the prime motivator here is autonomous driving. Can I do a time check real quick? How am I on time? I guess I'll just, I can't hear anybody's response. So, okay, thumbs up. So the prime example, I think, or the prime illustration of where game theory is important is on, let me show this thing, is on freeway merging. So we all frequently, I think many of us merge on the freeway. In traffic, this can be quite a negotiation. You can really feel the game theoretic dynamics at play. And in particular, when there is not a space for you in the lane that you're trying to merge onto, you have to anticipate that the other cars are altruistic enough or want to avoid collisions enough that they're going to make way for you. They're going to make room for you. Somebody will, right? Eventually, you're going to be able to get on that freeway. You don't have to stop and imagine that those cars are, you know, stone pillars that will never let you on the freeway. And so this requires game theoretic reasoning. And if you spend some time around the Silicon Valley where I live, you'll find that autonomous cars, which are frequently fielded around here for testing, they suffer from the frozen robot problem, which is illustrated here. If you end up merging with a solid line of traffic, an autonomous car will freeze. It will stop on the on-ramp because it can't reason about the fact that the other cars are willing to make way for it. It thinks of those cars as kinds of stone pillars that it has to avoid no matter what. And so the reason why this is a bit of a different problem from the usual game theoretic planning is that it's not a zero-sum game. So the iterative best response algorithm that I described before with the sensitivity enhancement, it only works for a zero-sum game. In a zero-sum game, the definition of that is that my win is your loss. Any unit of value that you lose from your objective function, I gain in my objective function. The sum of our two objective functions is always zero. That's the definition of a zero-sum game, of course. So what's much more practical and powerful in general is what's called a general sum game or a non-zero sum game, where, yeah, we have different objectives, but we're not literally in a head-to-head competition. And that's usually what describes autonomous driving. And so we've developed a custom algorithm. It's entirely different from iterative best response for solving these non-zero sum games. And I'm going to have to fly through the details, but essentially what we do is we form what's called the augmented Lagrangian. We take the constraints and append them to the objective to form the Lagrangian, and then we include what's called a second order penalty, and that makes it the augmented Lagrangian. And then we solve that Lagrangian directly using what are called root finding methods or Newton's method. And there's no iterations or anything. It's really much more of a traditional optimization approach to find the first order optimality conditions. We have a couple of papers listed here. And this is the work mainly by Simone Lecleach, my PhD student, and longtime collaborator, Zach Manchester at CMU. So it solves very quickly. And one insight that comes out of this is that generalized Nash equilibria in these autonomous driving and autonomous racing scenarios are often what are called, I should say, they're often non-unique. The equilibria exist in a continuum of equilibria. And you can find this through the method that we've proposed, because this method requires actually finding explicitly the Hessian of the underlying problem. And the Hessian is always ranked efficient. We can prove it. It's actually in this paper that we have in autonomous robots, that you can always show that there's linear dependency among the rows and columns in the Hessian, which means it's ranked efficient, which means there are literally directions in the game where all vehicles can move and the Nash equilibrium is maintained. And that's visualized here. And so when finding Nash equilibria, you have to regularize. You have to find a fair Nash equilibrium, because they're very skewed Nash equilibria or fair Nash equilibria. And so the concept of a fair Nash equilibrium is here. It's called a normalized Nash equilibrium. And the definition is that all the Lagrange multipliers that enforce the constraints have equal value. That's just to say we all pay the same cost for avoiding collisions. And this is important on the road, right? Because you don't want to be, you don't want your autonomous car to be the one who's pushing everybody else out of the way. You want everybody to pay a fair price for avoiding collisions. And so here's our solver, ALGAMES, which is solving the frozen robot problem. It's able to adeptly judge that the other cars will make way for itself so that it can move onto the freeway. There are there's I'd say one other alternative to solving these kinds of games. It's called Iterative LQ games. It's by David Friedrich-Kale and collaborators. David was actually a postdoc in my lab. He's a good friend. And ILQGames is an awesome algorithm with many strong properties. I'm just showing some timing examples here. So ALGAMES is our algorithm, ILQGames is the competing algorithm, and usually ALGAMES is quite a bit faster. ILQGames has other advantages, however. So here's ALGAMES compared to iterative best response, which is the first algorithm that I described. ALGAMES is way faster. This is a log scale. It is way faster and way faster in convergence and way better at satisfying the constraints. This is all in all just a superior algorithm. Now I'm going to wrap up here by talking about a forward-looking problem, which is really essential in the game theoretic context, which is what we call inverse game theoretic planning. Now, one of the underlying assumptions that commonly comes into play in game theoretic planning is that I know the objective functions of my opponents. But this is a little unreasonable. Maybe on a racetrack, it's reasonable because everybody's trying to win the race. So I can reasonably think that my opponent is actually trying to win the race. But in general autonomous driving, that's not a fair assumption. I don't really know exactly what my opponent's trying to do, right? I have to infer. I have to invert the game to infer what his objective function is or what her objective function is. And then I have to play the game assuming that prediction of the objective function is correct. And so we have a paper called LUCIDGames, again by Simone Lecleach, my PhD student, appeared in RAL last year, where we do just that. So here, the orange vehicle is the autonomous vehicle, and the orange vehicle doesn't know that this big yellow obstacle is impeding the way of the blue vehicle. And so the orange vehicle has to infer the objective function of the blue vehicle through observations. And that's what's being shown by these kind of blue dots is the orange's inference of the blue's planned trajectory. And so the way that we do this is we have an unknown objective function for our opponent, and we parameterize this. It looks like I'm out of time. I will wrap up. So we parameterize this with a linear parameterization, and then we're trying to find the parameters of this linearly parameterized objective function. We essentially use an unscented Kalman filter style algorithm. So we take an unscented transform, turn this Gaussian uncertainty into a set of sigma points, and then we make a prediction for each sigma point, and then weight them appropriately, and then update the sigma points, and so on. And so here you see again, the trajectories predicted by each of the sigma points are in red, and then the mean trajectory predicted by the UKF is in blue. We can also use this for safety critical planning, because you can take the Gaussian fit to the sigma points and use that as an uncertainty set, and then make that a collision avoidance constraint. So I'm going to wrap up there. I'm going to say thank you all for your kind attention, and to the workshop organizers for the invitation. And thank you, of course, to the brains and brawn behind this work, which are my very talented PhD students, my also one postdoc and my two collaborators. So thanks very much. I'm happy